Hello, and welcome to Bible Questions TV, the show that tries to answer the really difficult questions about the Bible. If you have any questions of your own, you can go to our website, biblequestions.tv, and submit a question. We'll answer every question that comes in, and we'll even use some of them as topics for future episodes of Bible Questions TV. In this episode, we're going to be addressing an increasingly forgotten part of history. Many objections to the Bible and Christianity center around the great atrocities done in the name of Christianity, such as the Crusades and the Inquisitions. Now, of course, none of those things are consistent with the Bible or the teachings of Jesus. Jesus, of course, said to love our enemies, not to kill our enemies. Nevertheless, people tend to view history in this way, that Christians have been the traditional aggressors. But the truth is, people who really follow the teachings of Jesus, actual Christians, have always been the ones who are being killed, not the ones who are doing the killing. The following video is from a history compiled in the 1500s about the true history of the Christians. Christians were first persecuted by the Jews in the 1st century, then followed by almost 300 years of persecution by the Romans. Then, contrary to many people's understanding, they were the main targets of the Inquisition of the Catholic Church for hundreds of years after that. This video is called Fox's Book of Martyrs, and if you would like to watch the entire video online for free, you can go to our website, biblequestions.tv. Let's check it out.
Why did the Roman emperors and Senate persecute the Christians so? First of all, they didn't understand that Christ's kingdom is not a temporal kingdom, and they feared for their powerful leadership roles if too many Christians followed Christ. Secondly, Christians despised false Roman gods, preferring to worship only the true living God. Whatever happened in Rome, famine, disease, earthquake, wars, bad weather, was blamed on the Christians who defied Roman gods. Death was not considered enough punishment for the Christians, who were subjected to the cruelest treatment possible. They were whipped, disemboweled, torn apart, and stoned. Plates of hot iron were laid on them. They were strangled, eaten by wild animals, hung, and tossed on horns of bulls. After they were dead, their bodies were piled in heaps and left to rot without burial. Nevertheless, the church continued to grow, deeply rooted in the doctrine of the apostles and watered with the blood of the saints. The third persecution. During the third persecution, Pliny II wrote to the Emperor Trajan, complaining that thousands of Christians were being killed daily, although none of them had done anything worthy of persecution. During this persecution, Ignatius was condemned to death because he professed Christ. At the time, he was living in Antioch, next in line as bishop after Peter. As he made the trip from Syria to Rome under heavy guard, he preached to the churches he passed and asked the Church of Rome not to try to save him. Condemned to be thrown to the lions, Ignatius replied, "I am the wheat of Christ. I am going to be ground with the teeth of wild beasts, that I might be found pure bread." The fourth persecution. After a respite, the Christians again came under persecution, this time from Marcus Aurelius, in AD 161. One of those who suffered this time was Polycarp, the venerable bishop of Smyrna. 3 days before he was captured, Polycarp dreamed that a pillow under his head caught fire, and when he awoke, he told those around him that he would burn alive for Christ's sake. Hearing his captors had arrived one evening, Polycarp left his bed and welcomed them, ordered a meal prepared for them, and asked for an hour alone to pray. The soldiers were so impressed by Polycarp's advanced age and composure that they began to wonder why they had been sent to take him. But as soon as he had finished his prayers, they put him on an ass and brought him into the city. As he entered the stadium with his guards, a voice from heaven was heard to say, "Be strong, Polycarp, and play the man." No one nearby saw anyone speaking, but many people heard the voice. Brought before the tribunal and the crowd, Polycarp refused to deny Christ, although the proconsul begged him to consider yourself and have piety on your great age. Reproach Christ, and I will release you. Polycarp replied, 86 years I have served him, and he never once wronged me. How can I blaspheme my king who saved me? Threatened with wild beasts and fire, Polycarp stood his ground. What are you waiting for? Do whatever you please. The crowd demanded Polycarp's death, gathering wood for the fire and preparing to tie him to the stake. "Leave me," he said. "He who will give me strength to sustain the fire will help me not to flinch from the pile." So they bound him, but did not nail him to the stake. As soon as Polycarp finished his prayer, the fire was lit, but it leapt up around him, leaving him unburned, until the people convinced a soldier to plunge a sword into him. When he died, so much blood gushed out that the fire was immediately extinguished. The soldiers then placed his body into the fire and burned it to ashes. which some Christians later gathered up and buried properly. Now the persecutions had extended to northern Africa, which was a Roman province, and many were murdered in that area. One of these was Perpetua, a married lady, 26 years old, with a baby at her breast. On being taken before the proconsul Minutius, Perpetua was commanded to sacrifice to the idols. Refusing to do so, she was put in a dark dungeon and deprived of her child. But two of her keepers, Tertius and Pomponius, allowed her out in fresh air several hours a day, during which time she was allowed to nurse her child. Finally, the Christians were summoned to appear before the judge and urged to deny their Lord, but all remained firm. When Perpetua's turn came, her father suddenly appeared, carrying her infant in his arms, and he begged her to save her own life for the sake of her child. Even the judge seemed to be moved. "Spare the gray hairs of your father," he said. "Spare your child. Offer sacrifice for the welfare of the emperor." Perpetua answered, "I will not sacrifice." "Are you a Christian?" demanded Hilarianus, the judge. "I am a Christian," was her answer. Perpetua and all the other Christians tried with her that day were ordered killed by wild beasts as a show for the crowd on the next holiday. They entered the place of execution clad in their simplest of robes, Perpetua singing a hymn of triumph. The men were to be torn to pieces by leopards and bears. Perpetua and a young woman named Felicitas were hung up in nets, at first naked, but the crowd demanded that they should be allowed their clothing. When they were again returned to the arena, a bull was let loose on them. Felicitas fell, seriously wounded. Perpetua was tossed with her loose robe torn and her hair falling loose, but she hastened to the side of the dying Felicitas and gently raised her from the ground. When the bull refused to attack them again, they were dragged out of the arena, to the disappointment of the crowd, which wanted to see their deaths. Finally, brought back in to be killed by gladiators, Perpetua was assigned to a trembling young man, who stabbed her weakly several times, not being used to such scenes of violence. When she saw how upset the young man was, Perpetua guided his sword to a vital area and died. The seventh persecution, A.D. 249. By now, the heathen temples of Rome were almost forsaken, and the Christian churches were crowded with converts. The emperor, Decius, decided it was time to crush the Christians once and for all. Fabian, the bishop of Rome, was the first person of authority to feel the severity of this persecution. The former emperor, Philip, had put his treasure into the care of Fabian. When Decius examined the treasure, there was far less than he had expected, so he had Fabian arrested and beheaded. Decius, having built a pagan temple at Ephesus, commanded everyone in the city to sacrifice to its idols. The order was refused by 7 of his own soldiers: Maximaeus, Martinius, Jonas, Malchus, Dionysius, Constantinus, and Sarian. The emperor, willing to try a little persuasion, gave them time to consider until he returned from a journey. But in his absence they escaped and hid in a cave. Decius was told of this on his return, and the mouth of the cave was closed up, so all 7 soldiers starved to death. Theodora, a beautiful young lady of Antioch, refused to sacrifice to the Roman idols, and was condemned to a prison. Didymus, her Christian lover, disguised himself as a Roman soldier and went into Theodora's cell, where he convinced her to put on his armor and escape. When he was discovered, Didymus was taken to the governor and condemned to death. When she heard of Didymus's sentence, Theodora threw herself at the judge's feet and begged that she be the one to suffer, not Didymus. The judge ordered them both beheaded and their bodies burned. Origen, the celebrated author and teacher of Alexandria, was arrested at the age of 64 and thrown into prison in chains, his feet placed in the stocks, which held his legs stretched widely apart. Even though Origen was rich and famous, he received no mercy. He was threatened by fire and tormented by every means available, but his fortitude carried him through it all, even when the judge ordered the torturers to prolong his suffering. During the torture, Decius died, and his successor began a war with the Goths, which turned the empire's attention away from the Christians. Origen was freed. He lived in Tyre until he died at the age of 69. Chapter 2. The Eighth Persecution, A.D. 257. When Valerian was first made emperor, he was a moderate and kind to the Christians, but then he fell under the influence of an Egyptian magician named Marcarianus, and ordered the persecutions to continue, which they did for the next 3 years and 6 months. Stephen, bishop of Rome, was beheaded, and Saturnius, bishop of Toulouse, was attacked and seized by the crowd there for preventing the oracles from speaking. On refusing to sacrifice to the idols, he was fastened by the feet to the tail of a bull, which was then driven down the steps of the temple, dragging Saturninus until his head opened and his brains fell out. None of the Christians in Toulouse had the courage to carry away his dead body until 2 women took it and buried it in a ditch. In Rome, Lawrence was brought before the authorities, who knew he was not only a minister of the sacraments, but also a distributor of the church's riches. When they demanded he hand over all that the church possessed, Lawrence asked for 3 days to collect it. On the 3rd day, when the persecutor demanded the wealth of the church, Lawrence stretched his arms over a group of poor Christians he had gathered together. "These are the precious treasures of the church," he said. What more precious jewels can Christ have than those in whom he promised to dwell? Furious at being tricked and out of his mind with anger, Lawrence's persecutor ordered him whipped, beaten, tied to burning hot plates of iron, then laid on a bed of iron over a fire and roasted alive. The first English martyr was a man named Alban, who was converted by a poor clerk who took shelter in his house. When the authorities eventually came for the clerk, Alban dressed in his clothes and went in his place. The judge recognized Alban and demanded he sacrifice to the heathen gods or die. When Alban refused, he was tortured and beheaded. The 9th persecution, AD 270. This persecution began under the Emperor Aurelian. Among those who suffered at this time was Felix, Bishop of Rome, who was beheaded. Agapitus, a young Roman who sold his estate and gave the money to the poor, was seized as a Christian, tortured, and then brought to Praenest, a city near Rome, where he was beheaded. These are the only martyrs whose names were recorded during this reign. The Spanish Inquisition. The Inquisition of the Church of Rome was, in its days, one of the most terrible engines of tyranny ever created by man. It may be said to date from about the year 1200, when Pope Innocent III sent his inquisitors among the Waldenses and other sects differing from the Church, and continued until 1808. In its course it totally crushed any Protestants living in Spain. Its final count numbered 31,912 people burned alive, and 291,450 imprisoned. In the 18 years that the Dominican monk Thomas of Torquemada led the Inquisition, 10,220 people were burned and 97,322 punished with the loss of property or imprisonment. Although its main victims were citizens of Spain, there were others who became its victims too. William Lithgow. William Lithgow was an Englishman born about 1580. Being fond of travel, he was on his way to Alexandria, Egypt, when he was suddenly attacked by 9 men, who threw a black cloak over his head and dragged him to the governor's house in Malaga, Spain. There he was accused of being an English spy. Nothing Lithgow could say would convince the local authorities that he was only a tourist passing through the city, so it was decided to torture him until he made his confession. Lithgow was tortured on the rack, and then asked if he acknowledged the Pope's supremacy, to which he answered, "You almost murdered me for the pretended treason without any grounds. Now you intend to make me a martyr for my religion?" "You have been arrested as a spy and accused of treachery," his inquisitors replied. "Perhaps you are not a spy, but we have found your books and writings, and you surely are a heretic, and therefore deserve even worse punishment than you have received." They gave Lithgow 8 days to consider whether he would convert or not. During this time, the inquisitor and others argued frequently with him to no avail. At last, finding their arguments had no effect, and that their threats of torment couldn't shake him, they left Lithgow alone. The 8 days were soon over. Lithgow was asked one more time to convert and save his life. "I fear neither death nor fire," he replied. "I am prepared for both, so do your worst." That night Lithgow was sentenced to 11 different tortures, and if he did not die from them, he was to be taken to Granada and burned after Easter. The first part of the sentence was carried out with cold-blooded cruelty, but it pleased God to give the poor victim strength of body and mind, and he survived. Then Lithgow waited with resignation for the day that would end his torments. All of this had been carried out in the strictest secrecy, since Lithgow was an English subject and not a citizen of Spain. But a servant boy happened to hear the city's mayor discuss Lithgow's case at dinner one night, and he secretly told the story to an English merchant in town named Mr. Wilde. Wilde told the story to other English merchants living in town, and to the English ambassador at Madrid, Sir Walter Aston, who quickly appealed to the king and council of Spain, obtained an order for Lithgow's immediate release, and put him on board an English warship visiting the city. 2 months later, Lithgow arrived safely at Devonport, England, although his left arm remained useless to him for the rest of his life. Although King Richard allowed himself to be influenced by Popes Urban and Boniface IV and published several decrees against the new Protestant doctrines, there is no record of anyone being put to death for holding them during his reign. Sir William Sawter. Richard II was deposed in 1399 and succeeded by Henry IV. In 1400, during a meeting of Parliament at Westminster, Sir William Sawter, a good man and a faithful priest, asked permission to speak for the good of the kingdom. The bishops present, suspecting that he wanted to address the subject of religion, convinced Parliament that the matter should be referred to the church convocation. So on February 12, 1400, Thomas Arundel, Archbishop of Canterbury, and his provincial council held a hearing with Sawter. They charged that he had previously renounced several heretical opinions, but continued to teach and preach them. The charges against Sawter, the parish priest of St. Skith, the Virgin in London, were as follows. He would not worship the cross on which Christ suffered. He would rather worship a temporal king, the bodies of saints, or a contrite man than the cross. He thought it was more important for a priest to teach the word of God than to say the canonical hours. He believed that the consecrated bread of communion remains bread, and it is not physically the body of Christ. Sawter was given time to prepare an answer to these charges. Reappearing before the convocation the following Friday, February 18th, he refused to abandon his beliefs, and was given one more day to consider his position. Still adamant, on the 19th, Sawter was ordered stripped of all his church offices, priest, deacon, subdeacon, acolyte, exorcist, reader, sexton, and even doorkeeper. Reduced to the state of layman, Sawter was then handed over to the secular legal authorities, and the church petitioned the king to execute him, something it could not do itself. King Henry readily agreed, becoming the first English king to ever put a heretic to death. Sir William Sawter became the first Englishman to suffer martyrdom in Henry's reign. After Sawter's death, others who believed as he did took pains to conceal themselves, while the unpopular king gathered what support he could, doing the will of the church, legally condemning the books of Protestantism and making burning of anyone convicted of heresy legal in England. John Badby. On March 1st, 1409, John Badby, a layman, was examined before Thomas Arundel, the Archbishop of Canterbury, and a number of other lords. The principal charge against him was that he believed that bread was not turned into the actual physical body of Christ upon consecration. When the examination was finished, and all the conclusions were read in English, the Archbishop asked Badby if he would renounce his beliefs and adhere to the doctrine of the Catholic faith. He answered that he would stay with his own beliefs. Badby was locked in the friar's mansion, with the Archbishop holding the key, until he appeared again on March 15th, was declared a heretic, and turned over to the secular authorities for punishment. That afternoon, John Badby was brought before Smithfield, put in an empty barrel, bound with chains to a stake, and surrounded by dry wood. As he stood there, the king's eldest son happened by, and encouraged Badby to save his life while there was still time, but Badby refused to change his opinions. The barrel was put over him, and the fire lit. When Badby felt the fire, he cried, "Mercy, Lord!" and the prince immediately ordered the fire extinguished. Then he promised Badby a year's stipend from the king if he would return to the faith of the church. Even then, Badby held his ground to the death. After Badby's death, the bishops, seeking to suppress this doctrine forever, and knowing that they had a king willing to act on their wishes, drafted a law that condemned the books of heretics and ordered all dioceses to proceed against heretics with zeal. Death by fire was declared the fate of any heretic who would not recant. After this, the Archbishop of Canterbury issued similarly harsh laws against Protestants. With all these laws against them, you would think the Protestants would have been utterly destroyed, and yet such are the works of the Lord that these men multiplied daily instead of being defeated. Their numbers especially increased in London, Lincolnshire, Norfolk, Herefordshire, Shrewsbury, Calice. Some, however, did recant. Among those were John Purvey, who recanted at Paul's Cross, John Edward, priest of the Diocese of Lincoln, Richard Herbert, and Emmett Willey of London, John Becket of London, John Senyons of Lincolnshire. William Thorpe. William Thorpe was a valiant warrior under the banner of Christ. He was examined before the Archbishop of Canterbury in 1407, accused of traveling through England for over 20 years, preaching his reform beliefs to the people. The Archbishop not only demanded that Thorpe deny his beliefs and return to the Catholic Church, but that he turn in anyone he found holding similar beliefs in the future. He was also forbidden to preach until the Archbishop was sure he was truly converted. "Sir," Thorpe replied, "if I agreed to this, I would have to be a spy for every bishop in England." Thorpe refused to pledge unconditional submission to the church. "I will willingly obey God and His law," he said, "and every member of the Holy Church that agrees with Christ." What happened to Thorpe after he was committed to prison isn't known. There is no record of his being burned, so he may have died in prison or secretly escaped. Poor Christians were being oppressed everywhere, but especially in England at this time, where the king supported the Catholic Church. The church was so strong there that no one could stand against it. Whatever it decreed was obeyed by all men. John Huss. Richard II married a wife native of Bohemia, and through her servants the works of Wycliffe were carried to that country, where they were effectively preached to the people by John Huss of Prague. Pope John the 23rd, seeking to suppress the Bohemians, appointed Cardinal de Columna to look into Huss's preaching and deal with any heresy he might find. So Columna set a date for Huss to appear before him in Rome. Huss never appeared on the designated date, but King Wenceslas of Bohemia sent ambassadors to assure Columna that any false doctrine being preached in his country would be taken care of by him at his expense. At the same time, Huss sent his own ambassadors to assure the cardinal he was innocent of heresy. Columna refused all their pleas and excommunicated Huss for failing to appear in person. The Bohemians couldn't have cared less about the proclamation of excommunication. The more they grew in the knowledge of the Lord through Huss, the less they cared for the Pope and his rules, especially since the church was divided at that time, with 3 men arguing over the office of Pope. Although the Bohemian church officials succeeded in having Huss banned from Prague, he carried on his work, spreading Wycliffe's message among the people and causing a great uproar over the church's riches and abuses. Wenceslas took advantage of his subjects' state of mind to levy heavy taxes on the clergy, silencing them in Bohemia and filling his treasury at the same time. In 1414, a general church conference was held in Constance to resolve the problem of the 3 popes and also to deal with the Bohemians. Assured of safe conduct by both Emperor Sigismund and one of the popes, Huss traveled to the conference, arriving in Constance on November 3rd. 26 days later, he appeared before the bishops to defend himself, but was not allowed to speak, in violation of the promises made to him. He was imprisoned for, quote, safekeeping and charged with 8 articles of heresy. On June 7, 1415, Huss was brought before a council and condemned as a heretic when he refused to recant his support of Wycliffe's theology. He was stripped of all his church offices, made to wear a paper hat with the words arch-heretic, and led past a fire consuming his books. On July 6, 1415, the hangman stripped Huss of his clothes, tied his hands behind him, and chained his neck to the stake. At that point, Huss told the hangman that he was glad to accept the chains for the Lord's sake. Straw and wood were piled around him to his chin, and the fire was lit. As the flames rose around him, Huss was heard to say over and over, "Jesus Christ, the Son of the living God, have mercy on me," until the flames choked him. When all the wood was burned, the upper part of his body was still hanging in the chain, so they threw it down, made a new fire, and burned it after cutting his head into small pieces. When he was totally burned, Huss's ashes were carefully collected and thrown into the Rhone River.
Suba Environmental Education of Kenya, or SEEK. The Nyanza province has the highest HIV/AIDS prevalence rate in Kenya. The child mortality rate is 206 deaths per 1,000 births. It has the lowest life expectancy rate in Kenya, which is 46 years, and it is the poorest province in Kenya. In the greater Suba district, the HIV/AIDS prevalence is 26%. 1/4 of its 210,000 people are orphaned children. The life expectancy is only 37 years, and the rate of unemployment is 40%. This is compounded by the fact that because of pollution and poor fishing practices, Lake Victoria, the source of much of the area's food, water, and jobs, could be completely depleted of fish as early as 2014, experts warn. This would be catastrophic to an area already in great need. SEEK is led by Don and Nancy Richards. Don is a former game warden and native of South Africa. His team provides education for Kenyans on the science behind biosystems that will bring positive change to both the environment and community. One such example of the training provided by SEEK is a multi-story garden. This biosystem takes up very little space near a home, but will adequately supply vegetables for the family. Other examples of tools that will help with health, poverty, and hunger are solar cookers, which eliminate the need for charcoal, which is the primary cause of deforestation in the area, or sun stoves, or composting toilets, to only name a few. Tippy taps are a simple example of the resourceful style that Seek uses to help families in the surrounding areas with no running water. A 2.5-liter plastic container is configured with minimal supplies to serve as an adequate hand washing source. In addition to providing the surrounding communities with education and tools to better health, hunger, and local ecosystems in the Lake Victoria area, this faith-based organization provides camps for children, stressing God's love, an individual's worth, and an individual's responsibility to both the environment and oneself. In beautiful art form, the Children's Museum displays imagery of the world while stressing personal responsibility for the care of God's creation. This sense of personal responsibility is also applied to sanitation practices that will both keep the child healthy and help prevent the spread of disease. If you're a new Christian or somebody that's just interested in learning more about Christianity, I want to send you a free copy of something that I've been calling the Christianity 101 DVDs, which you can get free at our website, BibleQuestions.tv. Basically, it's a data DVD. What that means is that it works like a flash drive. You pop it into your computer, you open it up, and you see all these files. I've put MP3s, movies, ebooks, audiobooks, just all kinds of stuff. In fact, 4 gigs of material that I think will really help you grow. It's totally free. There's literally no obligation. I do this because Jesus said in the Great Commission to make disciples of all men. So you can go to our website, BibleQuestions.tv, click on the Christianity 101 banner, and tell me where to send it. And it doesn't matter what country you live in, I'll ship it to you for free wherever you are. So there's 2 ways to order one. You can first go to the website, BibleQuestions.tv, and click the banner, or you can physically write me at Chris White Ministries, P.O. Box 110984, Nashville, Tennessee 37211. Thanks a lot.
Thanks for watching Bible Questions TV. If you want to see more about the video we were just watching, you can go to our website, BibleQuestions.tv. While you're there, you can order a free copy of the Christianity 101 DVD, or you can write to us at the address on your screen. Thanks to Chris White, Adam Larson, and NECAT Studios in Nashville, Tennessee. I'm Samuel H. Bolton, and we'll see you next time.